Hello, good afternoon. So welcome back to the 10th episode of Club Soda's Meet the Scholar series. So Club Soda are always looking at ways to collaborate with and engage with the research community, and this series engages academics in the fields of wellbeing, alcohol and sobriety to share their research. So I'm Claire Davey, a PhD candidate at CCCU, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation with the lovely Dr. Sarah Fox. So thank you for joining. Sarah is a researcher and lecturer within the Substance Use and Associated Behaviours research group at Manchester Metropolitan University. She was awarded the prestigious Society for the Study of Addiction PhD studentship, which we were all after. So lucky Sarah, and well done. But subsequently awarded her doctorate in February 2019. So she's gone on to publish a number of articles, chapters, and also guidance for practitioners and social workers that we're sort of going to touch upon today. And her research focuses on women's substance use using qualitative and creative methods. Particularly her PhD research was focused on domestic violence and substance use, and currently she's looking at the support needs of South Asian women who use alcohol and drugs, so perhaps we can touch upon that as well. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me and rescheduling as well.
That's okay, no worries. It's summer term is always, or I'm not sure whether that's what it's called, but summer term is always busy for academics, right, in terms of conferences and juggling all those needs.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
No problem. So I guess to sort of dive right in, we've got quite a heavy title right today with thinking about domestic abuse or domestic violence and substance use. And we're going to sort of dive into those areas and how they are associated or how they're linked and the challenges involved. But perhaps you could start off and talk to us about what do we mean when we're talking about domestic violence, perhaps generally and within the context of your research, if there are any differences.
Yeah, so I mean, terminology is important, isn't it? So we talk about domestic violence and domestic abuse, and it's used quite interchangeably. I prefer to use the term domestic abuse rather than violence, because I think when we think about violence, we just think about that physical aspect of abuse. But then many kind of victim survivors will experience domestic abuse. They might not necessarily experience physical abuse, but there might always be a threat of that happening. So I quite often use the term domestic abuse, which, taken from the Women's Aid website, is a pattern of incidents, incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, degrading and violent behaviour, including sexual violence. It includes coercive control, psychological and emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse, financial abuse, harassment and stalking, and more kind of online abuse as well, and digital abuse is coming out. I think when we think about domestic abuse as well, it's a term that's that includes people who are impacted by abuse from a partner or ex-partner, but also from a family member or carer. There's also terms like intimate partner abuse, which I use in some of my research, because it's more about abuse from a partner or ex-partner as opposed to family members or carers. But I think in thinking about domestic abuse more wholly, the majority of cases, abuse is perpetrated by a partner or ex-partner towards a woman, and women are more likely to be victims of abuse. But domestic abuse isn't restricted to gender, sexuality, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, or age. It can impact every member of society, and I think it's quite an important thing to remember is always that, don't ever assume that somebody is not the kind of person who wouldn't experience abuse. So in terms of domestic abuse and its definition, that's what we mean by that.
Okay, so we'll move forward today sort of using the term domestic abuse rather than domestic violence, if that works for you, and hopefully that sort of summary is useful for anybody watching as well, and hopefully we'll give some signposts towards the end if that applies to anybody who is watching today. And then sort of when we talk about substance use, your research is looking at alcohol and drugs.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, so I use the term substance abuse to kind of denote alcohol and or drugs. I think because some women will use alcohol and drugs, some will just use alcohol, some will just use drugs. For me, it's not necessarily about the substance specifically, and it's more about kind of the impact and the experiences in the relationship too, their experiences of abuse. So yeah, I tend to use substance use or problematic substance use, but it's quite a mouthful to say. So when I'm talking about it, and sometimes it's even like the definition of domestic abuse. Sometimes you'll say domestic violence, or domestic abuse, IPA. It uses so many kind of different terms for these things. But yeah, so substance use is the term I kind of talk about in terms of those who experience problematic relationship with drugs and or alcohol.
Okay, and you sort of mentioned a few minutes ago that it's something which is prevalent across, different genders, sexualities, and race. So perhaps, could you give us a bit of an overview in terms of like, well, do we have all the data, not necessarily you, but does one have the data? Does the government have the data around those different demographics, or is that really a sort of a gap in terms of our knowledge?
In relation to substance use and domestic abuse is like a co-occurring issue. So there is data, but it's quite difficult to assess sometimes because of like how we define abuse versus violence. Some research papers will focus on domestic violence and will only focus on the physical, the relationship between physical abuses, like physical abuse or sexual abuse, and the use of certain kinds of drugs or alcohol. And also how we define problematic substance use and how it's measured. Varies as well. So in terms of data, it can be difficult to kind of get a blank overall statement of, X amount of people are impacted by these co-occurring issues. But there's snippets of data around, and there's research papers around, the crime survey for England and Wales, for example, if we're going to think of like governmental kind of reports and stuff. They shows that there's a link between the two studies, or there's a link between the two issues, that perpetrators, those who have perpetrated abuse have used substances in the past 30 days. Those are victims of abuse have used substances in the past 30 days. I don't know the stats off the top of my head, Claire, so don't ask me the numbers. I'm not a numbers person. But, studies have shown kind of links and theories around the perpetration of abuse and using substances. And my focus is on women who are victim survivors and their use of substances. And studies have shown that women who use substances in a problematic way are more likely to be a victim survivor of domestic abuse, and women who experience domestic abuse are more likely or increased risk of using substances problematically. But it's important to say that, like, let's take alcohol for example. Alcohol doesn't cause abuse. And being a victim doesn't mean that there's going to be problematic substance use, problematic alcohol use. Problematic use can exist, be it the victim or perpetrator. It can occur before, during, or after an abusive experience. So it's very important that we don't say that like one causes the other. Go on.
Yeah, sort of removing that causal association, right?
Yeah. There's links, definitely. Yeah.
Perhaps you could like unpick. I mean, you've confirmed that there are those links between, one first and then the other, or the other way round. But sort of, what do you think is sort of driving those links, or some of the factors involved in the co-occurring presence of domestic abuse and substance abuse?
So I can only really speak to it in terms of like women as victim survivors, because that's what I focus on. I mean, in terms of perpetration, there's various links in terms of like attitudes towards women, growing up in a home where there's perpetration and substance use. There are studies around kind of the impact of certain substances on aggression and all of that. I don't really know that in too much detail because it's not my area, but in terms of women, there's various kind of theories, I suppose, using substances to cope with the impact of abuse, like self-medication hypothesis is a common hypothesis in drug and alcohol studies. you know, and how women might use drugs or alcohol as a way of coping with their experiences of abuse. What I've kind of, you know, found as well is there's often a cycle where there might be, you know, childhood abuse. A woman might experience abuse at childhood, physical or sexual abuse at childhood. And then there's problematic abuse later on, and then there's domestic abuse intertwined with that, and then there's continued problematic substance use. Now, obviously, it's not that straightforward, and it's not linear. You know, it's a lot more complex. But that kind of self-medication is a part of that, and sometimes it's, you know, women not necessarily knowing that they are self-medicating, obviously, or using to cope with their experiences of trauma and abuse. And for some women, you know, substance use is a survival strategy as well, using substances as a way to survive. A couple of women that I spoke to, you know, we talk about self-medication quite a lot, but women using it almost as a alcohol or drugs as like a protective factor. So using substances is in anticipation of abuse, almost like an anesthetic. So using I remember like some of the women saying like one woman said, you know, oh, I drink, so when he came through the door and bit the shit out of me, it wouldn't hurt so much. You know, that's exactly what she said. You know, so that kind of like drinking in anticipation to reduce the kind of the physical pain that it could have, like an anesthetic. And some of the women also talked about drinking in anticipation, like in terms of giving them confidence and not being as afraid when he came through the door. You know, that's kind of another quote. So there's that kind of idea of self-medication, but it's like a lot more complex almost, because it, you know, women, you're thinking about agency and why women might continue to use substances when they're in that situation. There's also kind of moving away from that self-medication using to cope kind of concept. There's also, I'm looking at something at the moment around coercive control too, and kind of links to, you know, how a partner might control, you know, what a woman takes, how much she takes, encouraging her to use because she might be easier to control, or, you know, trying to sabotage her efforts to get into recovery as well. And you know, there's been examples in some of the women that I've spoken to that kind of they feel that the perpetrator felt that they had this, I can't remember the term off the top of my head, but, you know, this ownership of the woman. They had something on this woman because you know, they were using substances. And when children are involved and, you know, women are mothers, you know, that gets far more complex as well because of the fear around accessing support, the fear of losing their children, you know, because of their use, and the perpetrator
Particularly
often
like
knowing that as well.
Yeah, like particularly a class dynamic there, right, as well, where, you know, in some of the research, not yours necessarily, I've seen, but if women are of, say, lower income groups, they're more likely to, you know, be at risk of losing children due to substance, you know, accusations of substance abuse or whatever, compared to those with independent income and so on.
Yeah. I don't know that kind of level of research in much detail, but yeah, kind of women from more socio-economically deprived areas, are kind of increased. Yeah.
One example comes to mind from my research, looking at women in online sobriety communities. So it wasn't specifically about domestic abuse, although I had some, you know, stories shared with me about that. And there was also this concept of like gaslighting. So one felt that their partner encouraged the drinking to then be able to gaslight and say, well, you did this, you know, which didn't necessarily happen in that way, but they always felt they felt that they were always in the wrong, or, you know, responsible for certain things. And then recovery, if we want to use that term, I know it appeals differently to different people, but recovery then gave them the opportunity to realize sort of, or identify abusive behaviors that they hadn't before. And so I wondered whether your participants had sort of identified that shift into recovery as being a game changer around domestic abuse or anything like that.
So it's interesting. So for the study that I did, so it was women who identified as having had previous or current experience of problematic substance use. So either they were actively still using or they were in recovery, and they had been victim survivors of domestic abuse. So I suppose part of that was like acknowledgement that they knew they had experienced abuse. In terms of kind of them accessing recovery and realizing kind of their experiences, it's a difficult one because most of the women that I spoke to didn't ever access support for domestic abuse. It was it was an either or in terms of, and we'll probably talk about this in a while, but in terms of access to support, in that, their focus had to be on their substance use because it was having a physical, eventually it was having an impact on their physical and mental health, and they needed to prioritize that, and they chose to prioritize that, but support wasn't available for them to be able to tackle both the substance use and their domestic abuse trauma experiences. So the women all spoke to me about their experiences of domestic abuse because that was the research that I was doing. But I can't remember any woman ever saying that, it was through support that they realized that they had experienced abuse. But part of that is because they didn't receive support specifically for the
understood.
domestic abuse. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come on to talk about those challenges in a minute. I know that we covered sort of the sort of coercive issues around the links and then also self-medication. Is there anything else that you wanted to sort of drop in there about the links between domestic abuse and substance abuse?
I think it's just seeing it as more than just self-medication, and that, okay, well, you're not with him now, so you can stop drinking. Do you know what I mean? I think it's I think we need to see it as being a lot more kind of interlinked, and their experiences. I'm just thinking about one woman who was using problematically, and she wanted access. She was she had been talking to a domestic abuse service on the phone for a couple of weeks, and they offered her space and refuge. But they said to her, you can come, but you can't drink. Now, this woman had been drinking a bottle of vodka every day, so she couldn't just stop drinking. Medically, way too dangerous, obviously, for her to do that, and she acknowledged that herself. But she was in a situation where she didn't know what to do, and the service she was engaged with didn't offer her any other solutions around that. And I think it's part of that, like, understanding or lack of understanding around the kind of the complexities of both issues and how intertwined it can be, especially when there is that kind of coercive control around that, in terms of a partner controlling everything you do, including how you use substances or don't. And especially if a partner is encouraging your substance use because you're more vulnerable and you're easier to control, kind of just stepping away from that and stopping substances straight out is not that straightforward.
Yeah, it's not an isolated decision. It's got other sort of factors at play. And so something that I thought was interesting from your research was how sort of substance abuse or histories of substance abuse could be used by partners or social services to work against them. So is that something that you could talk about a little bit?
Yeah, I wouldn't say services necessarily, unless you've read something in my research that I've forgotten. I wouldn't say it's services necessarily kind of worked against them. I think it is just a lack of understanding and a lack of training, and we're probably going to come on to that, In terms of partners, I'm just thinking about the women that I spoke to. Again, it's just that it comes back to that kind of just coercive control, more so. There wasn't any women who, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, the women, I don't think there was any that kind of said, it was more that he I say he because most of the women that I spoke to had a male partner, ex-partner, who was the perpetrator. How he would just take control more. So for some women, their partners did drink or use substances, and for some they didn't. So it's just, I think it's just that controlling nature. Again, I think, I'm thinking of examples of those who didn't, the partners who didn't use substances, and how they used the woman's use as a way of making up. So one example, sorry if I'm rambling here. One woman, I remember talking about, she would have a drink in anticipation of him coming home. He didn't drink. There'd be physical abuse, and all of that. And then he would go off to the shop, buy her a bottle of wine, and come home as a way of making up to her. So I think when I think about it, I think about that kind of cycle of abuse. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's this kind of cycle of domestic abuse, and it's kind of that build up to an abusive episode, and then once an abusive episode happens, kind of that honeymoon period, and that making up period, and thinking about how alcohol can be used in that, I think is quite interesting. But it's only something I'm starting to think about. I have no idea if that's answered your question, Claire. For me, I think it's just the coercive control, I think, needs to be explored in more detail when we think about substance use,
Yeah, and also what's interesting to point out there, I guess, is that, you've identified that substance use can be used as a way of like bridge building in a domestic abusive or, intimate partner situation. And so, again, it's not always like a fully, not to say that that's not abusive, but it's kind of used as this reward concept or this apology mechanism. Which I think people, it's something to identify and look out for, right? That it may not flag instantly as part of domestic abuse, but it's in the mix.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to this kind of whole thing about domestic abuse versus violence, that there doesn't have to be violence, physical or sexual abuse or violence, for it to be an abusive relationship. And it's trying to find the signs and see the signs of that,
draw the connections between different behaviours or experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, and so we've sort of edged towards it, but thinking about, what are the challenges that women that you interviewed and perhaps more generally face when trying to seek assistance or help for this co-occurring situation of domestic abuse and substance abuse?
Yeah. So so this kind of came about around when I was doing my master's a few years back. I don't want to think about how many years back that actually was. So I've worked in like different services. I did a bit of work in homelessness. I've done a bit of work in domestic abuse services. I've done a bit of work with drug and alcohol services and so on. So a bit of work around social care. One thing I kind of noticed was, for example, if a woman came to refuge or came to, a DV drop-in or a phone line and needed, a place of safety, needed to get away, if there was substance use, especially if there was drug use, she wasn't going to get it. And, in terms of a practice perspective, I get it, because, there's safeguarding, especially if there's children and other families, if it's a shared refuge space, it's quite a difficult one to manage. So for my master's, I spoke to drug and alcohol practitioners to understand how they responded to DV disclosures. And it was really interesting. But what stood out for me mostly was, I remember one practitioner saying to me that, they didn't ask about DV because it was opening a can of worms. It's just the term opening a can of worms is just, it's fascinating. So that's what inspired my PhD research, because I thought, if some practitioners are afraid to ask about domestic abuse, then what actually is happening, and what support are the women getting who experiencing domestic abuse but also have these drug and alcohol problems? So my PhD looked at women's experiences of support when they had substance use and domestic abuse. And the women reported that like the biggest barrier was that disconnect between substance use support and domestic abuse support. There was an example of a woman. She told me she was offered a home detox, but she lived with an abusive partner, and I'm pretty sure she said she told the CAT team that she was living in an abusive relationship, but all she was offered was a home detox, which doesn't really work when you're living in quite a volatile situation. And as touching on the example I've already given about that woman who was offered a place, but she was told she had to stop drinking, and medically she couldn't stop drinking, and she didn't know where to turn, and thinking that if that service had said, okay, we can't take you right now, but we're going to put you in contact with this drug and alcohol service that we work with in the community, see if we can get you detox, and then we can keep the space and take you. That situation could have ended up very different from that woman who ended up staying with her partner, and physical abuse got a lot worse before she was able to kind of pull away and things changed for her. But that obviously didn't happen. So it was that kind of disconnect between services. As I've kind of said, none of the women that I spoke to were offered support for their combined experiences, and most of them never received support for domestic abuse or their trauma. The focus was always on their substance use. So in terms of barriers, part of it is about support, and that gap in support, and the fact that women almost have to either or. They either have to, and going back to the woman, the second woman that I just spoke about, who was told she just had to stop drinking. This kind of, she eventually got to a point so bad with the domestic abuse that she went back to them. She took the refuge space and she detoxed herself over a 2-week period, in secret. So she was in this space and she just slowly reduced her drinking over a 2-week period until she stopped. And then I think somebody had put her, a friend or somebody had put her in contact with a drug and alcohol support worker, but she didn't have that, so she had to try and figure it out herself, which could have gone, any way really. So that lack of support, that kind of lack of knowledge across both substance use and domestic abuse kind of practices around the impact of the other. But there are some amazing examples as well. I don't know if you're familiar with Trevi, Trevi House, and they're based down south. Down south from me. I'm in West Yorkshire, so I know that's a lot of the country. I think they're around Bristol somewhere. But they do some amazing work supporting women who want to get into recovery, but who also have got experiences of trauma, some fantastic stuff. But it's potluck and services like that are few and far between. And part of that is funding. As we know, it always comes down to funding and a lack of resources for services to be able to kind of offer that more holistic, trauma-informed way of working. But it also comes down to training is as well. As I said, as the practitioner from my MSc said, I don't want to open a can of worms, but if she had the training, would it have been different? And what would her response be? And would she be able to say, well, actually, we don't offer it specialist, but I have a contact number for a DV service and we work, collaboratively to try and support that woman.
How much of that, how many of the challenges, if you like, are based on the experience of the individual, and I'm going to practitioner that you interact with and their knowledge, or whether it's to do with sort of overall guidance or funding from the individual initiatives, right? It seems a bit of a potluck situation.
Yeah, it really does. And in terms of potluck, if we think about social workers, for example, social workers don't have core training in substance use or domestic abuse. It's not part of their core curriculum when they do their training. It is a potluck depending on the university that you go to as to how much training in that area you get. Now, child and family social workers, I'm not going to say the majority because I don't know the stats off the top of my head. I think it's around 50-60% of their cases there is substance use or domestic abuse. If we look at the serious case reviews, we can see that. But social workers are not trained in substance use and identifying substance use and identifying domestic abuse and responding to in trauma-informed practice and that. So it does kind of, your training has a big part to play in that, and that doesn't need to be an expensive thing either when we think about funding and resources. It can be something as simple as linking up with, if you're a drug and alcohol service, linking up with your local domestic abuse service and offering, sharing training, go, right, we'll train your crowd, you train our crowd, and let's have this referral pathway, or let's just keep in touch if this comes up and we need to support each other. But that then comes down to time and resources, doesn't it? And how stretched social care practitioners are across the board.
Yeah, it sort of relies on that collaboration between services in particular geographical areas. I know things are moving online, but obviously if you're looking for a refuge space or in-person meeting, recovery meetings and in-person therapy, then, it's got to be all localized sort of in the same area.
And there's that thing as well, is that women, and this has just come from, some of the women that I've spoken to, but the power of having that knowledge and having that understanding and the impact that that can have on that individual seeking support. Remember some of the women I spoke to, they had different experiences of social work for different reasons. Some women have their children removed. But a couple of them said, oh, I spoke to one worker and she got it, she understood. It's almost like she had a similar experience, and I really connected with her, and I think it can just be that, not necessarily having that lived experience yourself as a practitioner, but just having that knowledge and understanding, and working more of a kind of holistic way.
Yeah, an awareness of those links, right? So we talked, I noticed that you keep sort of using the term trauma informed, and I think anybody perhaps outside of existing social services space or whatever may not be so familiar with trauma informed. So can you sort of give an overview of it, but also like what benefits it could bring to sort of not resolving, but helping with this link between domestic abuse and substance abuse?
So trauma informed is a bit of a hot topic at the moment in social care services. Like, it's cropping up everywhere, isn't it? And it's interesting because it's like, how do you know you're being trauma informed? And are you really being? And there's a lot of kind of questions around, are you being trauma informed? Or are you just saying you're being trauma informed because you offer a women's group once a week? Do you know what I mean? Which is a survey a couple of years back did that. They looked at kind of women's spaces and trauma informed work, and services saying they're being trauma informed, but actually it was like a knit and natter group, for example, which there is power in, women's spaces. But in thinking about trauma, so let's think about trauma first and foremost. Like, what is trauma? So, the APA kind of definition of trauma is, an emotional response to a terrible event or series of events, I think is the definition. So domestic abuse, rape, childhood abuse, and so on. So trauma-informed practice is grounded in, I suppose, kind of a complete understanding of how trauma or traumatic experience or series of events may impact that individual and impact them on like a neurological, biological, psychological, and kind of social way. So it kind of, and I quite like this, it starts from the position of like what happened to you as opposed to what is wrong with you. And I really, really like that. Kind of working in a holistic way that takes account of that person's lived experience. Now, we had the conversation about lived experience before we came on, but that person's whole life, like what happened to them that they're here now and they're using drugs problematically, for example. Gabor Mate talks about substance use and how it's never about the drug itself. It's always about something that has happened before that. So, as I said, it's taking account of the whole person's experience as opposed to just focusing on that one issue. So trauma-informed practice is about creating a safe environment for that individual and working slowly to build up trust with that individual, and using psychologically informed support, therapeutic support and counselling, to be able to help that individual, I suppose, move forward into recovery of some sort. So that's recovery from substance use or recovery from traumatic experiences, or both. And stable and trained staff are important. And I keep coming back to staff, and it's more than staff. You know, if we look at it in kind of a systems setup, it is more about this, more than the staff themselves. But, you know, stable and trained staffing is, you know, a vital part of that. So yeah, does that answer all your question, Claire? I can't remember.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So I think that's given an overview of, you know, how trauma informed, or the benefits of being trauma informed, and actually what it is versus just providing a safe space for women to talk, right, which is important, but not quite the same. And so
but an important part of that, I think, is like one of the first steps, isn't it? Like safety first is such an important step, isn't it, in accessing support for anything. So yeah, safety is an important part of that, and then building up that trust, I think, you know, is linked to that as well.
Yeah, and I guess like thinking about sort of the NHS model, especially if, you know, you're seeking help for substance abuse or mental health issues, you know, my understanding is that it's more of a medicalized model. So it is asking those questions around what's wrong with you rather than like what happened to you. And so you almost have to fit these criteria before you can access services. And I'm guessing, you know, when we think about domestic abuse services, that hotlines that you ring and so on that operate outside of the NHS or, you know, in parallel with, do not have those same medicalized requirements. Is that right?
No. In terms of DV hotlines, no. See, I say DV there, TA hotlines. No, they're there to listen to women's experiences. It's, you know, it's not as much of a tick box as it might be in the NHS, for example. Yeah.
Okay. And so trauma informed, I know that there are some charities out there as well that do specific work on trauma informed training and what it is and all that. And so, you know, we can always signpost that. But in terms of a lot of recovery circles or support to change drinking behaviours is going online, and that's part of my research. And so that's kind of where I wanted to draw the links to. But from my understanding or my research, I can't see that many of the online sobriety communities do take sort of a trauma-informed approach, and they are working with men and women. But like, how do you think, you know, that could enhance or provide, you know, additional support? If, you know, how could they get into sort of the trauma-informed space?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because an online space is such a different environment from like that kind of physical face-to-face, building trust with that person, time, you know, that. And I don't know much about online spaces as well, which is why this is your specialist area of research. I think in terms of like what online spaces can do, you know, it is just about signposting. It's having that information. I imagine it's a difficult one to monitor, you know, in terms of safe spaces online. It's a lot more difficult to monitor, you know, if we think about like women's only spaces and what does that mean, you know, in the physical world as opposed to the online world. You know, that in itself is a difficult one to monitor. So I think just signposting and sharing information, I think, is a good place to start. Because all it can take is one post online for somebody to go, actually, I think I need to maybe start thinking about this or talking about this, or, you know, like, this is what domestic abuse looks like, or this is what coercive control looks like, and here's a number or an online chat that you can, you know, access to have a conversation about this. So I don't know if I've given you as much meat in that answer as you know, because online spaces isn't something that I think is fascinating. I think it's so important, and I think we need to look at this more because more and more people are going online for answers. I do it all the time for loads of different things, you know, joining different peer groups online. But I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's peer groups and the importance of peer support groups as well.
Yes, you know, a lot of the value that they bring is that peer, facilitating the peer-to-peer. But I guess I'm coming at it from the perspective of knowing that, say, the majority of those who use online communities are women because of the anonymity. Anonymity, and also sort of the flexibility, right, which plays right into that domestic abuse context. And
Yeah.
so I think more could be done to flag
Yeah.
those issues or to
Yeah.
be trauma informed. But I guess there's also
Yeah.
a dynamic of not trying to be all things
Yeah.
to all people, right?
Yeah.
Online sobriety communities were not set
Yeah.
up to be domestic abuse
Yeah.
hotlines,
Yeah.
but it's just being able to create that collaboration in
Yeah.
the way that you would expect it to be in person, perhaps,
Yeah.
or like in physical spaces.
Yeah, I mean, they can be a first step, can't they, into somebody accessing that support. So again, you know, it's signposting. It's, you know, it's potentially having, you know, a trauma-informed practitioner or domestic abuse, you know, person come online and do something like this, or, you know, short snippets, you know, that can be available to women. I think you know, that online space is so important for women because we know that women are less likely to access support for drug and alcohol use as it is because of the, you know, the fear, especially when there's children involved, the fear of social services getting involved, you know, the stigma, the shame associated with it. So online spaces are a really important resource. So having, you know, kind of, as I said, yeah, different, I don't even know what the term is. This is how out of touch with online spaces I am. I suddenly feel very uncool.
Yeah, I mean, again, much like DV and DA, there are a number of terms that are used in the academic community about these spaces, but I don't necessarily think that the online communities themselves use them. So whatever language appeals. You know, I'm conscious of also time and people watching. We've still got time left, but if people do have comments and questions, please do put them underneath the viewing platform where you are, and we can answer or address them we'll address them anonymously, but obviously your name's going to come up when you put it on there, and this is a sensitive topic, so we'll just signpost things at the end as well in case that's of use to people. So thinking about perhaps moving on and thinking about how women, you said that women typically did not receive domestic abuse support and they were accessing recovery support or for substance abuse. So what was, you know, typically their route in, and or what would you suggest is a better, you know, the best route in from your experience of interviewing women, you know?
Their route into support for substance use?
Well, perhaps more of a collaborative, you know, the co-occurring address, you know, is there a better way in than what you've seen women pursue?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you kind of pointed out, the women that I'd spoken to, most of them didn't receive DV support because it got to a stage where it wasn't a priority because their substance use had gotten to such a stage that their physical health, you know, was the priority. Or, you know, there is that one woman I referred to who got herself into refuge and detoxed herself slowly and then accessed the substance use support after a friend had put her in contact with it. It is, I think it kind of comes back to collaborative working, you know, but it's so difficult to do when you've got staff constantly, you know, coming and going. And the precarity of working in social care and third sector. But it is, I mean, in an ideal world, you know, and I was talking to this about with the students recently, around like criminal justice and access to support. You know, in an ideal world, it's a one-stop shop, isn't it? It's a space that women can come to for, you know, substance use support, domestic abuse support, but mental health as well. Mental health is a massive factor in all of this. You know, all of the women I spoke to had mental health of some kind, you know, to varying degrees. So it's creating a space, I think, in person, but also online to get that initial kind of information. But it comes back to staff having to be trained to know how to respond. And I think that's important. I think part of not asking the questions is not knowing what to do with the responses. And we can't ask about, you know, domestic abuse if we don't know what to do with that information, you know, and that's really, really important. So I'm not asking substance use practitioners to start asking about domestic abuse. Know what you're going to do with that information if you are.
True. Yeah, you've got to have an action plan, you know, a sort of flow chart, knowing what the steps are if certain answers come to the fore. And I guess, you know, if you are a person or a woman, maybe there's two different answers to this question, but you're seeking help for domestic abuse, and then you also have a substance abuse issue, what would with all the knowledge that you have, right, what would your first step be?
Safety. Like, right, okay, yes, you're using alcohol or drugs or whatever it is, but are you living with somebody who is, a physical threat to you, right? Let's find you a safe space, and then we can start thinking about the substance use. That is, it's this housing first approach. We see it in kind of, that kind of conversation when it comes to like people who experience homeless, safety first, house first, somewhere safe for them to be, to then start tackling the substance use and tackle the mental health and the trauma and all of that. Because if you're living in a situation, where you're trying to come off alcohol, for example, you're trying to detox off alcohol, but you're living with somebody who's, physically abusive, or maybe not, controlling. That's very hard to be able to do that. So yeah, I think for me, it's like a safe space is the starting point, and then it's time, and it's trauma informed and psychologically informed support and practice. Yeah, for me it is. I'm just going to keep banging on about it. Safety. A safe space can make such a difference.
And I think that's important to highlight to people that, you can't work on everything at once.
No.
You're not going to be able to do everything in the same 4 weeks or whatever. And so, you have to pick off the priority list, right?
Yeah.
And safety is probably the way to go. And so thinking about what solutions are available. And I guess when we're looking at, or when people are looking at safe spaces to go to, identifying the language that they're using perhaps on their website or on their hotline, things like trauma informed, is there anything else that you would say that you would recommend, that they look out for when they're talking to a practitioner, or looking at information about where they're going, or just be grateful that they can find a space? That is also,
well, space is limited. I say that, and I say this is, in an ideal world, it would be safety, and it would be having somewhere to go, but we know that that's also not the case. Substance use aside, if you don't have substance use, it's very, very difficult to get a place of safety and refuge. And so many women don't want to leave their house, and they shouldn't have to leave their house as well. That's the other thing. Their house should be a place of refuge, where they live should be a place of refuge and safety. But it's not that simple, unfortunately.
Especially there's that dynamic if they have children as well. You don't, you can't leave necessarily, or you don't want to leave them there, or finding a space that can accommodate all of you is more challenging.
So the part of that is about perpetrator programs as well, and I, as I said, I don't know enough about kind of perpetrator programs and what research has been done. I know there's some interesting research being done. The advanced study in KCL at the moment are doing something on perpetration programs and substance use and models of support around that. But it is, focusing on perpetrators as well, and what they do, and access to support and so on that they receive as well. Because it always falls on the victim to make a change and upturn her entire life. So there is, there's a space to kind of focus on perpetrators as well, and accountability.
I've noticed in my local area, which is Southeast, there has been clearly council investment in perpetrator programs, or that's what I've seen advertised. So, they are potentially out there. So give them a Google as well, which is, a good step.
I
think somebody has to be engaged with it as well, but it is another option.
I think I think just thinking about it as well, like peer support makes, can have a huge, there's your women's aids and your refuge and all those organizations, but women's centers, in your local community, women's spaces in your local community as well. That kind of peer support can be a good place to start as well, or online peer support, you know, women's spaces online as well can be a good place to kind of start. You know, just having those conversations and looking for information. There's I know, I think it's Women's Aid. It's either Women's Aid or Refuge, but I think it's Women's Aid have an online chat as well. So you can go on and do like an online, you know, you don't have to call up somebody, you don't have to go and find their local office. You can just have like, you know, go on an online chat. There's also an app as well that you can download. I can't remember the name of it. But
You
yeah,
can always share those
Women's Aid's
details. And
websites are a great resource. But yeah, I think peer support, I mean, just going back to the women that I spoke to, peer support was like one of the biggest kind of benefits to their recovery, facilitating their recovery, whether that was like AA or other forms of like peer support groups that they were involved in their local communities. One of the women said to me, it wasn't, you know, the practitioners were important and you know, my therapist was really important, but actually it was sharing my experiences with other people and seeing that other people experienced the same thing as me made a huge difference. So, you know, not losing that focus and the importance of peer support, but I think it's peer support and it's that kind of practitioner trauma informed support.
yeah, unfortunately,
Multiple different.
Yeah, it's down to the individual to create this patchwork, right? But
Yeah.
of different things. And
Yeah.
I guess, you know, I would echo that in terms of online support, online sobriety communities, I guess, or Dr. Sally Sanger's research is all about, you know, sort of someone like me, and people find that value there.
It's identity, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think what I've noticed from my research, although findings not yet published or peer reviewed, but is that there are certain women-only collective groups within then the broader communities, and within those groups, certain subjects around like parenting, menopause, you know, physical health conditions of women, mental health conditions of women are being discussed. So don't feel like it's only about substance use. It is often much broader than that, and it might be a good place to sort of start and get support, and also signposting, right? I think in terms of, you know, you have produced guidance for practitioners as well, right? And so that's another key area. And so we've been talking as if to an audience who are sort of looking to address their alcohol or substance consumption. But, you know, if there are any practitioners out there who are sort of like interested in this, keen on this, want to see how they can help, you know, what sort of guidance would you give them, or signposting would you give them for that?
Yeah, so we have the BASWA. BASWA stands for the British Association of Social Work. So we've got the BASWA Pocket Guides, which is focused on substance use and domestic abuse, and it kind of gives an overview of the topic, some do's and don'ts, you know, training and the importance of training and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, that can be accessed online. Remind me what your question was, Claire. Sorry.
If you were a practitioner and you were interested or eager, wanted to improve, you know, what you personally deliver or your support service, you know, where would you signpost them to start that journey?
Yeah, so there's a pocket guide. I think seeing webinars are such an accessible way of kind of getting some training in now, isn't it? So seeing what's online, what training is available, but also, you know, if you're a practitioner in substance use, you know, just scouting to see what's in your local area and going, can we get, you know, shared training in here, you know, getting somebody in to speak to your organization. But online, I mean, there's so many online resources now. BASWA is a good way to go. Women's Aid, you know, so many drug and alcohol organizations. There's so much online information. That's what I would. I don't know if that's helpful, but
no, that's helpful. And I think, you know, something that's come up in my sort of local feminist activism is that there is often a pot of cash locally within local governments, admittedly not huge amounts of cash, but, you know, focused on training that is underutilized because it's not publicized necessarily. And so that's admittedly you need to find the way in, but it might be a good way to sort of think about, can we tap into this to get training for 3 people, and start there.
Or also accessing if there's a local university, seeing who specializes in certain topics in your university, because academics love talking about their work. Do you know what I mean? We love a soapbox. So, well, I can't speak for all academics, but I know many who would happily come and give training and would talk about, what they know on the topic as well, and often for free. I can't say, I can't speak for everybody, but there are many in ours are more than happy, in our substance use research group would be more than happy to come in and go and talk to services about whatever it is that they wanted to.
Yeah, and I guess they've all got engagement targets or strategy, development plans as well.
Impact, innit?
Impact, right? Community outreach, impact. So, do reach out to those people. It might not be the individual that you contact that's going to do it, but somebody will know someone who's able to do it.
Yeah, academics have got lots of contacts. I'm starting to realize that, somebody will email me about something. I go, oh, actually, I know somebody. I'm going to introduce you to such and such, and kind of go from there. So yeah, utilize, your local colleges and universities if you've got them close to hand as well. A really valuable resource. And yeah, your local services. It's about building, I suppose, if you're a practitioner, it's not feeling like you're on your own. And just kind of somebody has to kind of just start that, don't they? They have to kind of put themselves out there and just start making contact. And you'll find that there'll be a lot of people who are really keen to get, training in this area and others, and building up kind of a resource of training that you can share amongst each other.
Yeah, I know one charity which might be worth looking at is Victim Focus. I don't know whether you've come across that, which has some webinar, sort of webinar pamphlet type things as well. If you a broad range of training abilities, all trauma informed, so it might also be a good
I would say Ava Against Violence and Abuse, based in London, they're a fantastic organization. They have so many resources. They do training all the time. I know they're offering training in trauma informed practice at the moment. They have so much guidance, and they have what's called the Stella Project, which they did back in like 2006, and it's a resource for practitioners working in substance use, domestic abuse, and I think mental health. And it is just so much information there about like how to respond to what you can do, changes you can make in your organization, changes you can make, as an individual, and so on. So definitely check them out. They're a fantastic resource.
Okay, we'll try and sort of name check all of these and collate sort of some signposts in, where we pin this in show notes sort of thing going forward. But I'm conscious of time, and so I know that you're engaged on a new project with sort of Alcohol Change UK around South Asian women and their experiences of recovery. So what are you looking to do there?
So we're looking at women's experiences, South Asian, British Asian women's experiences of substance use and support again, and focus specifically on substance use, not domestic abuse. And as part of that, we're doing interviews with South Asian women themselves, who are either actively using or in recovery from alcohol or drug use. We're also speaking to women, we're calling them women from the community. So South Asian women who don't have problematic use, or, they don't drink, or they do, but, not in a problematic way. To get so we're holding focus groups with them to get their opinion on and their understanding on substance use within their community. So how do they respond, or what are their views on other women in the community who might have problematic use? And we're also speaking to practitioners who might work with South Asian women or BAME communities as well. And part of that is looking at the potential role that like stigma and identity might play on women's experiences and trajectories into problematic use, but also their experiences of support and recovery as well. So we're still interviewing. So if there's any South Asian women watching who want to take part, please contact me. We're still interviewing women and hosting focus groups. And it's really fascinating. I think, we went into it with some presumptions about women's experiences, and their access to support, and the role of kind of stigma and shame on their experiences. But what we're kind of learning is that once the woman kind of acknowledges or identifies that she's got a problem with substances, and she discloses that to the family, the family are very supportive, and they just, will move heaven and earth to try and get the support that they need. I've not read all the transcripts yet, so I can't speak in too much detail about it or what the findings are. But yeah, I suppose it's challenged our kind of preconceived ideas of what might be the findings of.
I think there's definitely sort of a challenge around making sure that recovery spaces or pathways are accessible to those of different cultural communities, right? And we need to learn from those communities as to what's happening and
what works, what's best for them, what works for them, definitely. And also, that kind of the relationship between gender, culture and substance use is really, fascinating. And that's something that the focus groups are bringing up, because we're kind of done a focus group with a group of Muslim women. We're doing a focus group with a group of Sikh women. We're going to do a focus group with a group of Hindu women, just to see kind of, what role, gender has on their experiences of alcohol or their views of alcohol use. And I'm conscious of time here, but I'll just say that, the group of Muslim women that we spoke to, it kind of was one rule for them and a different rule for the boys, around alcohol use and expectations. So it's interesting. Yeah, I've
had a participant from my study, similar, approach of it's dealt very proactively within the family and the community generally, but she has tried to outreach to her own community around these issues and feels that there's sort of like a silence, and that's from someone who is within their own community trying to do activism and just consciousness raising, right? So lots of dynamics at play, but hopefully once you've read the transcripts and sort of
a while to go.
You can come on and talk a bit more about those findings. But anybody who is, of the South Asian, you're not just Southeast Asian, are you? So South Asian,
British Asian
communities that are, want to talk about substance use and problematic substance use, they can get in touch with your study. Okay, well, that sort of brings us to the end of the hour. So thank you to Sarah to show up and talk about her research and sort of unpick some of those challenges. And thank you for watching. It has been a sensitive, emotional subject to deal with. So we'll sort of put some links up if anybody needs to access those support. And thank you for taking the time. So until next time.